Louise Gallagher got a flutter in her stomach that she couldn't ignore when she met Conrad Cheney.
He was really mysterious and romantic. Everything about him was exciting.
But mystery turned to misery when Conrad's dark past became Louise's even darker present.
Everything she knew was a lie. It was an absolute living hell for her.
The amount of control that he had over her was astounding.
Fueled by terror, Louise was forced to make the ultimate sacrifice to save the ones she loved.
She was trapped. There was literally no escaping.
I was in a panic. I couldn't believe I'd entrusted my life to such a monster.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Investment executive Louise Gallagher had no intentions of mixing work and play in August of 1998. The 44-year-old single mother from Calgary, Canada, knew what her priorities were.
I had two amazing young daughters, Alexis and Lisanne, who were 12 and 10 years old, and I really needed to focus on them.
But her attention shifted that fall when a new client pulled up on the scene.
It was the company that manufactured kit cars. And I had gone to talk to this company that was looking to go public.
And when Louise met the company's senior partner, 45-year-old Conrad Cheney, she was instantly charmed.
When I first met Conrad, I shook his hand and, I had that sense that I'd met him before. And I said,
"We met before? You look really familiar."
He looked deeply into my eyes and said, "Oh no, if we'd ever met before, I'd never have let you go." And I thought, ooh, wow, that's quite the line.
When Louise told me about meeting this wonderful man, she described it to me as almost a magnetic force. She was mesmerized by him.
So when Conrad asked Louise out on an official date, she decided it couldn't hurt to mix a little pleasure with business.
We went to one of my favorite restaurants, and Conrad was really charming. He spent a lot of time telling me how beautiful I am. The flattery was a little overwhelming, but I couldn't deny my attraction to him.
But as Louise blushed, Conrad suddenly turned pale.
Midway through the dinner, suddenly Conrad got really shaky and started to have, belabored breathing. I had no idea what was going on. He got up from the table and made a phone call, and then two guys from his plant came and they left. I was feeling really unnerved. To disappear like that, it's very strange.
Several days passed before Louise finally heard from Conrad, and his explanation created more questions than answers.
Conrad called and told me that he had been quite ill. I asked him what it was, but he wouldn't talk about it. It was clearly distressing him. I was definitely worried about him.
Over the next few weeks, however, Louise's concerns were overshadowed by Conrad's charm.
Conrad was the ultimate romantic. He sent this huge bouquet of flowers one day with a note that just said, "From one of your greatest admirers." So I was falling hard for him.
I thought he was really charismatic. I could tell my mom was genuinely falling for this man, and so to see her find someone was really exciting for us.
After 3 months of dating, Conrad treated Louise to a spontaneous weekend getaway. And the surprises didn't stop there.
We got there and were at dinner, and he pulled a ring out of his pocket. I mean, it was stunningly beautiful. I was shocked. And I said, "This is way too soon. We need to just take this slowly. There's all the time in the world."
That's when Conrad made a dire confession.
He said, "I have a heart condition. If I don't take care of it,
Could be dead by Christmas."
just a couple of months away." I was stunned. I couldn't believe that here's my Prince Charming and he's gonna die.
Conrad told Louise the only thing that could save him was an experimental surgery in California. So that night, Louise accepted Conrad's marriage proposal.
I didn't know if he would survive this surgery. But how could I say no to a man who loves me so deeply and needs me? I felt that I had to do this for him.
But Conrad's heart wasn't the only thing in trouble. And before long, Louise would find herself drawn into a dark underworld that she couldn't escape.
Louise had no idea what or who was out there, and she was terrified.
We were blindsided when things began to unravel.
I was in too deep, and it wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted.
In the winter of 1998, Louise Gallagher was devastated to learn from her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, that he had a rare heart disease and his time was running out.
Conrad told me that he had 3 months to live. Needless to say, I wanted to spend every moment with him that I could.
But according to Conrad, with a risky surgery scheduled in the coming weeks, he was too busy to spend much time with Louise. Still, Conrad was there for Louise when it mattered most. When she needed knee surgery that November, it was Conrad who came to her rescue.
When I was released from the ER, Conrad was right there to pick me up. But as I got in the car, I saw him pick something heavy off the front seat and move it into the back seat. I thought it was a gun. When I mentioned it to him, he reassured me that it was just a toy. And it was something left over from his daughter's Halloween event or something. I laughed at myself because that was just really weird of me to even think that.
After spending New Year's Day together, Louise said a sad goodbye to Conrad as he left for his surgery.
I'd asked if I could go to California to be there, but he said that that wouldn't be a good thing because he needed to conserve his energy. So I remember feeling so lost because I knew he may or may not survive.
Finally, 4 days later, Louise received a call, but it wasn't from Conrad.
It was his associates calling me to say that they believed it was a success. They said he wasn't able to talk. They were trying to keep him really quiet and calm.
She was relieved that he'd made it through the surgery, but still very frustrated to be here in Calgary. She really wanted to be there with him.
So Louise was overjoyed when her fiancé returned the following month and said he was fully recovered.
I was just ecstatic to be with him. But I must admit, he looked really healthy for a guy who'd had this crazy, risky surgery. But I just decided to let it go.
But what Louise couldn't let go was the feeling she was inching closer to the bottom of Conrad's priority list.
Conrad was always too tired from recovering or too busy catching up at work. And I began to feel more pushed to the side.
Louise's feelings of doubt were replaced with dread when Conrad gave her some crushing news.
I was sound asleep and the phone rang. It was about 1:30 in the morning. And I answered the phone, and all I could hear was Conrad crying.
Sorry, Louise. I'm sorry. Are you all right?
And what Conrad said next would force Louise into a prison of fear and paranoia that would change her life forever.
It was like a living hell for her.
When he said those words, it was like someone kicked the air right out of me.
In February of 1999, Louise Gallagher received a frantic phone call from her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, that turned her entire world upside down.
All he would say was, "I'm so sorry, I've put you in harm's way."
Sorry, Louise. I'm sorry.
And he told me that he was part of an organized crime family and that they had discovered his love for me. I was stunned. I couldn't believe that it was true.
According to Conrad, his mafia family was angry that he was in love with someone outside their trusted circle. After all, with pillow talk comes loose lips.
I didn't have any secrets to share, but Conrad would say they don't believe that. And he said he had received an envelope, and in the envelope, there were 3 bullets, and one for me, and one for each of my daughters. It was a warning that we were in danger. I just remember this feeling of being absolutely terrified.
Louise thought a call to the police was their only hope, but Conrad had other plans.
He said, if you go to the police, they will know, and that's what would trigger them to kidnapping the girls.
Terrified and unable to sleep that night, Louise thought back to her relationship with Conrad. And suddenly, all the pieces came together.
The gun made sense. I just thought to myself, oh my God, it must not have been a toy gun at all. So I was angry with myself because I put my daughters in this situation. And it was all my fault. And I didn't know what to do.
To keep her daughters safe, Louise kept the mafia threat to herself, but slowly the secret ate away at her.
This was not something I felt that they needed to carry, so I had to pretend like everything was just fine.
But soon after, the threats against Louise seemed to become a reality.
One day, one of my neighbors came over and she said, I saw somebody sneaking around your car. And I phoned Conrad, and he immediately sent his associates over to look for bombs under the car. They never found anything, but it was just this constant, unsettling fear.
Louise's only peace of mind was that Conrad had her followed everywhere for her protection.
I thought it was scary and unsettling, but he had had me followed, and he always knew where I was. But he was protecting me and my daughters.
Later that summer, the stress of the situation caused Conrad's health to take another grim turn.
I got a phone call from one of his associates saying that Conrad was in California in hospital and that they were going to put him on life support system. Part of my mind went to this place that said, Conrad is protecting me and my daughters, and as long as Conrad is alive, then my daughters are safe. But if he died, I just didn't know what was going to happen. I was terrified.
Within days of learning of Conrad's condition, Louise ran into a friend at a local coffee shop. Alone and afraid, she broke down and told him about her fiancé in a coma in California.
My friend agreed he wouldn't tell anyone, but a few days later, I received a phone call from a woman who was a friend of my friend, and she just said, my daughter Rebecca is talking to a man on life support in California as well, and his name is Conrad. And I thought, no, that can't be.
Flooded with emotions, Louise arranged to meet the woman that very day at her home and discovered Rebecca's Conrad and her Conrad were one and the same.
She just broke down, and I just got really angry. It was like someone stabbed me in the heart, and I was in shock.
Enraged, the two women immediately drove to Conrad's office to demand information on his condition and whereabouts. And what they found was appalling.
We walked straight into Conrad's office, and sure enough, there he was, sitting behind his desk. He should be on life support, but he's not. He's sitting there. Rebecca just started yelling at him. But I was just absolutely speechless.
Louise may have been at a loss for words, but Conrad wasn't.
He said that he had lied about being on life support to protect us. He hoped it would somehow shake the mafia off of his trail. He had started seeing Rebecca in the hopes that it would take the mafia's attention off of me. But it didn't change the fact that he was cheating, and I was devastated. Conrad said that he was going to end everything with Rebecca and reminded me of what could happen if I broke up with him.
If Louise walked away and then something happened to one of her daughters, she'd never forgive herself. She couldn't take that chance.
Conrad told Louise he ended it with Rebecca, and for the next 3 years, Louise stayed under Conrad's thumb, always fearful of when his mafia family would make their move.
My sister and I realized that Conrad was toxic.
You have to break up with him.
It was really clear that she had no intention of leaving him. So we went to live with my dad.
That was the moment my heart just broke. They didn't know I was only staying with Conrad for their own protection. That was best for them that they stay with their dad, because with me, they would be in danger.
By January 2003, the strain and threats were becoming too much. So Conrad came up with a solution. The couple would steal away in the middle of the night to the Canadian countryside, where no one, not even the mafia, could find them.
All I could think of was that I had to get him away from the people I loved. So I just went with him.
But soon Louise would discover that the mafia was the least of her worries. There was something much closer and much more dangerous to fear.
She had no idea what Conrad had in store for her. She never saw it coming.
My biggest fear was that I'd never be able to tell her that I still loved her.
I remember thinking, he's gonna kill me. Today's the day.
In the spring of 2003, Louise Gallagher was convinced that she and her fiancé, Conrad Cheney, would be safe from the mafia by hiding out in the Canadian wilderness.
For 3 months, we stayed in a bed and breakfast out in the country. But Conrad was acting so different. He would scream and he would remind me of how all of it was my fault. I was just terrified. I just thought he was going to kill me because he had to get rid of me. And I kept waiting for him to do it.
After almost 4 months of hiding, they had some unexpected visitors.
I was in a panic. I thought the police were going to tell me that something had happened to my daughters and that this, all of it, had been for nothing.
Louise was shocked and relieved to learn that it wasn't her daughters that were in trouble. It was Conrad.
They had a warrant and they started to read off the list of charges and they told him he was under arrest. And I thought, who is this man?
Conrad wasn't wanted by the mafia. He was wanted by the law for charges of breaking and entering, fraud, and forgery. And thanks to Louise's loved ones, police were able to track him down.
When Louise vanished, we had a sense of the peril she was in. So we went to the police and we told them that we knew she was with Conrad.
The police had warrants out for Conrad's arrest, so they knew that if they found Louise, then they would find Conrad. So they managed to track Louise down through a check that she had written.
And when they did, Louise was dumbfounded to find that nothing about her fiancé was as it seemed.
Conrad presented this image of a very, very successful business when in fact it was crumbling. It was close to bankruptcy. And that's what led him to open cell phone accounts in his daughter's name. He had purchased a car in his aunt's name, and they filed charges against Conrad.
This lightning bolt hit me, and it wasn't until then that I realized just how deeply rooted Conrad's lies were.
It turned out Conrad wasn't just broke and a fraud. He was a cheat and a stalker as well.
Conrad told Louise he was going to break up with Rebecca, but he kept seeing her. She tried to break up with him. He didn't like that, so he began stalking Rebecca, harassing her. He broke into her home, and she had him charged for that.
Police took Conrad into custody, and Louise's family brought her back to safety and to her daughters.
My sisters and my mom had flown them out to Vancouver to see me. And it was so magical. Alexis and Lisanne are the reason I'm alive today.
I don't think I could put into words how much I love my mom and how thankful I am that she made it through.
With Conrad behind bars, Louise learned the truth from police and finally realized she was just a pawn in his sick game.
The only heart condition Conrad ever had was that he didn't have a heart. He was not part of an organized crime family. They were not these evil men waiting out there willing to kidnap the girls. Everything he told me was a lie. I felt used and I felt empty and I felt devastated.
In July July of 2003, Conrad Cheney pled guilty to fraud, forgery, and breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 2 years, 1 month, and 26 days in federal prison.
This wasn't about a love affair gone bad. It was about abuse. I didn't believe evil existed, but I believe evil does exist now.
Today, Louise has healed from her experience, and she's stronger than ever.
I have gained back my self-respect, and I've gained my daughters back. And we have a relationship that is stronger and is filled with love and caring.
The light is definitely back in my mom's eyes, and I don't think that there will ever be anything that could extinguish that again.
I can't stop an abuser being who they are, but I can't stop their abuse in my life. Nothing can destroy me as long as I stand true to me.
After 10 years of marriage, single mom Christy Smith was looking for someone with an edge.
Randy was wild and exciting, and he treated me like a total princess.
He made my mom laugh, and they meshed well together.
But Christy had no idea her new love's deception would cut like a knife.
I didn't think anybody could ever be that evil.
And the man who brought her so much pleasure would bring her unimaginable pain.
It was absolutely sadistic what he did.
I just kept screaming. The pain was unreal.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. In the fall of 1999, 30-year-old Texan Christy Smith couldn't deny that after 10 years of marriage, the magic was missing.
There was no excitement, there was no passion. So all of a sudden I found myself separated with a 13-year-old and an 8-year-old. But I was very excited to start dating, to get back out there.
So it seemed fortuitous when that October, she and her best friend Crystal ran into an old high school friend, Randy Cooper, at a local bar in Fort Worth.
I had a very big crush on Randy when we were in high school, and I just thought he was gorgeous.
So when Randy mentioned that he was recently divorced, he had Christy's full attention.
Randy was working odd jobs, just anything to make money. But he was just as gorgeous as I remember.
As the three friends reconnected, however, it seemed Randy had his eyes set on Crystal.
Randy was attractive, and he was so funny. So I decided to go ahead and give him a chance to go ahead and go out with him.
I would have wished it was me, but it was fun being around him. After the night we met, we became very good friends.
But the following week, after one date with Randy, Crystal decided he wasn't the man for her.
I met him at a restaurant, and within 5 minutes of him telling me that he was in prison,
I don't know, don't worry about it.
I thought, this man is weird and crazy. I told Christy that I knew that this was not a man I would ever date.
She just thought he was too wild. And Randy would tell me stories that just seemed unreal. I wasn't really surprised because I really knew Crystal and that he wouldn't be her type. But it didn't bother me at all. It actually intrigued me. Bye.
So when Christy dropped by Randy's house a few weeks later, she was excited when he hinted that he wanted more than a friendship.
Crystal just doesn't get my humor.
He said, but you do. He said, and we have so much fun together. He was interested in actually dating me. I was just on cloud nine.
Over the next month, Christy began seeing Randy regularly, despite her friends' disapproval.
The more I tried to get Christy to stay away from Randy, the closer they got. So I did not hang out with Christy while they were together.
Randy always said Crystal's just jealous. It bothered me when Crystal would talk about Randy because I was crazy in love. We had so much fun together.
But the icing on the cake was seeing how great Randy was with her kids.
Randy was fun to be around. He would spend time with us, not just my mom. He would tell us jokes and would always cut up with us.
He even kept Christy entertained with his over-the-top storytelling.
One morning, Randy said, "Have you ever heard of Possum and Snake?" And I said, "No." So he told me that a possum comes up and there's a snake by the river.
And the snake's cold.
Tells the possum, "Will you please let me in your pouch to get warm? If you'll help me, I won't bite you." So the possum lets him in his pouch, gets him across the river.
And as soon as he does, the snake curls up to strike. And the possum says, "Wait a minute, I thought you weren't gonna hurt me." And the snake says, "I'm a snake, stupid. What did you think?"
Then the snake struck the possum and killed it. I had no idea why Randy told me that story.
What does that mean?
I just didn't get it. But Randy kept me on my toes. And I loved it, every bit of it.
So after 2 months of dating, when Randy asked her if he could move in, Christy was ecstatic.
We always wanted to be together, and the children seemed to really like him. And so he moved in. I was a really lucky girl.
But Christy had no idea her luck was about to run out when Randy's wild imagination would become her terrifying reality.
His behavior had changed so drastically.
He had a plan and nothing was going to stop him.
I saw the joy he took in causing pain. He was just evil.
In February of 2000, Christy Smith had been separated from her husband for 1 year when her new boyfriend, Randy Cooper, moved in with her and her 2 kids.
My ex-husband did want me back, and he was very upset about Randy living in the house. But I was so happy to have everyone I loved under one roof. When I was with Randy, I felt like nothing in the world could harm me, nothing.
But a week later, Christy became troubled when Randy made an odd discovery.
So I go out in the garage, and he's got a handful of like empty chip wrappers, empty candy bar wrappers.
What is this?
He said he had found them all in the attic.
There's piles of this stuff.
He said, "It almost looks like somebody could be staying in the attic." I thought, oh no, that's crazy. There's no way. So I just kind of, blew it off.
Then the following week, Randy came home with more disturbing news.
Randy said that my ex-husband had followed him home.
He was wearing a disguise in the car.
And he was wearing some type of disguise. I was shocked. I was like, there's no way. My ex had not a mean bone in his body. But Randy insisted it was my ex-husband. So I asked my ex, "You're not parking at the end of the street, are you?" And he said, "No, why would I do that?" So I thought Randy was just blowing this all out of proportion because he had a very wild imagination.
Christy was starting to seriously worry about her boyfriend.
He started getting a lot more irritated about things, like if the children left the lights on, he would take the light bulb out.
You turned the lights off.
I thought it was really weird for doing something innocent like leaving the lights on. It seemed like his mood would change at the drop of a dime.
Don't do it again.
He just wasn't the happy-go-lucky Randy that I was used to.
Electricity?
I was worried that I had just fallen for the fairy tale and that it just wasn't gonna work.
But on Valentine's Day, her concerns soon subsided when Randy's doting nature returned.
Open your eyes.
My ex-husband had taken the kids for the whole week, so Randy would just do romantic things. I got my old Randy back again.
And on February 23rd, nothing would top Randy's display of affection.
We had went to the bar, and we had got there. He looked at me and said,
Today's gonna be a special day.
he gave me a kiss, and he walked up onto the stage, and he said,
Hey, I'm gonna need everybody's attention.
I have found the love of my life.
Christy, come on up here.
And he said, Christy, will you marry me? I was just so excited. It was so unexpected. And I said yes, of course. And he just seemed like he was on cloud nine.
The lovebirds ordered a round of drinks for all, and the celebration began. But the excitement quickly caught up to Christy.
And I told Randy, I said, my head was spinning, and I started having problems with my stomach. And he said, well, let's get you home, babe.
When they arrived, Randy gently led her to the bedroom.
I said, well, go on in and put on something cute and lay down, and he would bring me some aspirin. So I went in and put on a negligee. I was trying to stay awake. I guess I'd kind of dozed off a little bit.
Moments later, Christy awoke to an unrecognizable voice.
Wake up, bitch! I thought you were my angel, but you're just a lying whore!
After her boyfriend proposed on February 23, 2000, Christy Smith dozed off peacefully, but woke up in a nightmare.
Wake up, bitch! I'm gonna torture you. You're gonna wish you were dead.
And he said, you're gonna know pain like you've never felt pain.
I thought you were my angel.
Then he reached over and he punched me in the face. And I was just shocked.
Before Christy could even react, Randy grabbed a bat.
He hit me in the head with a bat. And I kept putting my hands over my head. And he said, better put them hands down. And I started screaming, and I kept asking him why. Randy said, I kissed a male friend of mine at a time before me and him had started dating. And he told me that he was gonna torture me until he knew the truth.
Did you kiss him?
What he was asking didn't make sense. Why would he care if I kissed this man before we dated? And I said, I love you, Randy. I would never cheat on you. And he said that that was a lie. And then he doubled up his fist and he hit me.
You're lying to me!
The pain was unreal. And my face was bleeding. And I kept telling him I didn't do it. But I'll tell you I did. If you'll just stop. Just stop. And he just laughed and swung again. Then he choked me till I lost consciousness. And I woke up and he was slapping me in the face. And he said, you're not getting away that easy. I thought Randy was going to kill me.
Randy was unrelenting as he continued to torture Christy over the next several hours.
There were tools on the dresser. And he picked up this belt buckle. And he hit me from head to toe. He picked up the wire cutters and the pliers, and he started to cut my nipples off. It was just the most unbelievable pain.
Then Randy suddenly paused to show Christy his handiwork. Just as hope seemed lost, Christy's thoughts turned to her children.
I loved my kids too much, but I was not gonna let him win. I was not. I had to be there for my babies. In that moment, I knew that if I didn't make it to that phone, that there was no hope. And the thought came to me, I told Randy, let's just try to call my friend, that guy that you were accusing me of kissing, and he'll tell you the truth. He'll tell you if I kissed him or not.
All right.
And he said, if you can't make it into the kitchen, you're not gonna have any idea what pain is.
Christy crawled to the kitchen to get to the phone.
And as soon as I got a dial tone, I called 911.
911, what's your emergency? Hello, are you there? Hello?
On February 24, 2000, after suffering hours of unimaginable torture at the hands of her fiancé, Randy Cooper, Christy Smith could only hope her attempt to call 911 had worked.
I didn't know if I got through or not, but Randy was screaming he was gonna kill me before anybody could get there.
Seconds later, 911 made a routine follow-up call.
Hello? Hello? No, actually my son did. Well, actually, I picked up the telephone.
Then I just screamed like nobody's ever screamed. And he hung up the phone, he started screaming at me. I told him, just take my car, just go. I don't care, just go.
As Randy searched for her keys, Christy made it to the bathroom.
I got the window open and I got the door locked. And that's all I had left. The pain was just so overwhelming.
Two patrol officers were dispatched. When the officers pulled up, Randy was walking out the front door. They noticed that he had blood on his clothing and blood on his hands, and he kept trying to tell the officers that children had made the 911 call.
My kids, they might have been playing with the phone, you know.
But they heard faint screams coming from within the house. Officers detained Randy outside, and the other officers made their way into the house.
Police discovered Christy barely conscious.
Randy's trying to kill me.
She was bloody and bruised, and she was telling them that Randy was trying to kill her. She had significant injuries. Something horrible had gone on in the home. I haven't seen any assault like that ever. Randy told the officers that Christy had come home in that condition, but it was obvious to officers that a disturbance had gone on there. They found blood in the bedroom, ball bats, a hammer, pliers, apparently items that Randy had used on Christy at the time. From that point forward, Randy would no longer speak to the police and ask for an attorney.
Randy Cooper was immediately arrested while Christy was rushed to the nearest hospital.
Christy had skull fractures, a broken jaw, broken teeth. She had a broken arm and significant bruising and cuts all up and down her body. I was amazed that she was still alive.
I knew that Randy was crazy, but I didn't think anybody could ever be that evil or how anybody could do that to another person.
It was really horrifying to find out what happened. I talked to my mom on the phone while she was in the hospital. She told us that everything was okay and that she'd be home.
While awaiting Randy's trial over the next 2 years, Christy healed physically, but emotionally she was still suffering.
I remember just still being in shock. It didn't make any sense how he could hurt me that bad, because I loved him completely and with all my heart.
On July 9, 2002, Randy Cooper pled not guilty to the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
At the trial, I learned that Randy's ex-wife had been beaten repeatedly. He had been very threatening to women for years and years.
I would describe Randy's actions is sociopathic, especially given light that he tried to lie to officers. I believe if Randy had actually killed Christy, that later down the road, other people would be in his crosshairs as well.
Christy couldn't help but wonder if Randy had been planning the attack all along.
There was no real reason behind what he did because he thought I kissed a male friend of mine. It was like he was grasping at a reason to hurt me. I believe Randy was trying to set up my ex-husband from the very beginning. I think he saw that there was a possible way to kill someone and get away with it. I think that the whole time he had been planning to torture me.
And now she understood why Randy might have chosen her instead of her best friend.
I think he saw me as an easy mark because I was trusting. All I kept thinking is how I could have been so gullible, how I could have been so wrong.
On July 11th, 2002, Randy Cooper was found guilty and sentenced to 99 years in prison.
I loved him so much, and I would have done anything except die for him. Randy won the battle, but I won the war because I lived.
Today, after countless surgeries, Christy still suffers a great deal from her injuries.
I have my good days and my bad days. I have to deal with unbelievable pain. And it is a limited life that I have, but at least I have one.
It's going to be a struggle for her the rest of her life. But the motivating drive for Christy during this whole ordeal has been her children. That keeps her motivated.
In hindsight, Christy finally understands what Randy meant by the possum and the snake story.
That was one of the main red flags. He was trying to give me a hint of what a snake he was. But in my possum and the snake story, the possum is a survivor.
The night Illinois stopped breathing began with a routine traffic stop on a rain-slicked highway, a simple flick of red and blue lights cutting through the darkness, a moment so ordinary it barely deserved memory, and yet hidden inside that fleeting second was the echo of a scream from 30 years earlier, a scream that had never truly faded, only buried beneath time, fear, and the quiet conspiracy of forgetting, waiting patiently for a single mistake to rip it back into the world. The rain fell in thin, icy needles, blurring the windshield of the patrol car as it rolled along Route 47, a lonely stretch of road slicing through fields stripped bare by winter, where the wind moved like a restless animal and the silence pressed hard against the ears. The officer's shift had been uneventful, a string of minor violations, a broken taillight, a missed stop sign, nothing more than the steady grind of small-town policing. Then the scanner crackled. A dark sedan, erratic driving, possible intoxication. The car was spotted drifting across lanes, its tires hissing across wet asphalt, as if the driver were fighting an invisible pull. The cruiser accelerated. The lights ignited. And history, long dormant, quietly stirred. The vehicle slowed, veering onto the gravel shoulder. Its engine coughed once, then settled into a low, uneasy idle. The officer stepped out, boots crunching softly on wet stones, the night closing in around him, the scent of rain and cold earth hanging heavy in the air. Inside the car, a man sat rigid behind the wheel, hands fixed at 10 and 2, knuckles pale, eyes staring straight ahead. He looked older than his years, his face lined by fatigue and something deeper, something harder, like a life spent constantly bracing for impact. His name, according to the license, was Daniel Harper. Age 58. Local address. No outstanding warrants. No criminal record. Just another driver, just another stop. Or so it seemed. The officer leaned closer, catching the faint smell of alcohol, mixed with something metallic, something sharp, a scent that triggered an instinctive tightening in his chest. A question. A pause too long. A flicker of panic in the man's eyes. Then the slightest tremor in his right hand, barely perceptible, but enough. The routine script faltered. Backup was called. The man was asked to step out of the vehicle. Rain streaked down his jacket as he stood beneath the flashing lights, shoulders hunched, breath uneven. And in that fragile space between compliance and resistance, something broke. His voice cracked. Words spilled out, tangled, desperate, incoherent. A name, a date, a place, and then a phrase that landed like a thunderclap. I didn't mean to kill her. 30 years earlier, on a humid August morning in 1992, the town of Willow Creek had awakened to sirens and disbelief. The body of 19-year-old Emily Carter was discovered in a shallow drainage ditch just beyond the edge of town, her pale skin stark against the dark mud, her eyes open, frozen in an expression that seemed to ask a question no one could answer. She had been reported missing the night before after failing to return from her shift at a roadside diner, a place where truckers and late-night workers crossed paths beneath flickering fluorescent lights, where coffee was cheap and conversation was currency. Emily was known there for her quiet smile, her careful kindness, the way she remembered regulars' orders and asked about their families. She had plans. College brochures folded neatly in her bedroom drawer. A suitcase half-packed beneath her bed. A future just beginning to unfold. The ditch lay less than 2 miles from her home. The scene was chaotic, raw, unguarded. Muddy footprints trampled fragile clues. Rain threatened to wash away whatever secrets the ground still held. There were signs of a struggle, broken twigs, disturbed soil, a single shoe lying several yards from the body, its laces still tied. No witnesses came forward. No weapon was found. The autopsy would later reveal blunt force trauma and asphyxiation, but little else. The time of death was estimated within a narrow window, but the hours were thick with uncertainty. And so, almost immediately, the case slipped into that gray territory between evidence and speculation, where suspicion multiplies but answers remain scarce. Willow Creek was a town that trusted its own reflection. Front doors were left unlocked. Children rode bicycles long after sunset. Neighbors waved from porches and shared casseroles in times of grief. The murder of Emily Carter cracked that fragile illusion, exposing the fear beneath. Candlelight vigils lined Main Street. Yellow ribbons fluttered from telephone poles. Her photograph stared out from every shop window, a constant reminder that something terrible had passed through and might still be lurking just beyond sight. The police worked around the clock, canvassing homes, questioning co-workers, retracing Emily's final hours. They traced her steps from the diner to the bus stop she never reached, followed the thin trail of possibilities through cornfields and back roads, but each path ended the same way, dissolving into silence. Rumors bloomed in the absence of facts. A jealous boyfriend, a drifter passing through, a customer who lingered too long, asked too many questions. Names surfaced, then faded. Alibis were scrutinized, then discarded. A composite sketch circulated briefly, its vague features haunting but useless. As weeks turned into months, the investigation slowed, momentum bleeding away as leads dried up and hope thinned. The file thickened, the questions multiplied, and Emily's name joined the long, aching list of Illinois cold cases, unresolved, 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 a drumbeat that echoed in the minds of those who still remembered. Her parents aged beneath the weight of waiting. Her mother kept Emily's room untouched, dusting the shelves, smoothing the blankets, as if her daughter might walk back through the door at any moment. Her father spent nights in the garage, dismantling and reassembling old engines, hands busy, thoughts relentless. Every phone call sent a jolt of adrenaline through their bodies. Every unfamiliar car slowed outside the house ignited a flare of hope, then disappointment. Years passed. Investigators retired. New officers inherited the file, leafed through brittle reports, stared at grainy photographs, and felt the same helpless frustration as those before them. The town learned to live around the absence, to step carefully across the wound and pretend it had healed. Until that rain-soaked night, when a trembling man stood on the shoulder of Route 47 and whispered a confession that no one was prepared to hear. Daniel Harper's words tumbled out in fragments, disjointed and raw, as if the dam he had built inside himself for 3 decades had finally collapsed. He spoke of a chance encounter, a ride offered, a moment of anger spiraling out of control. He spoke of panic, of the crushing realization that there was no turning back. He spoke of a body left in the dark, of driving away while the echoes of his own heartbeat drowned out everything else. The officer listened, stunned, the rain soaking through his uniform, the cold seeping into his bones, each sentence tightening the knot in his stomach. Backup arrived. Then detectives. Then a forensic team. The highway was sealed. The man was taken into custody, his face hollow, eyes distant, as though he had already retreated into some internal courtroom where the verdict had long been decided. News traveled fast. By dawn, Willow Creek was awake, phones buzzing, radios murmuring, televisions flickering with urgent headlines. A name long buried surged back into public consciousness. Emily Carter, 19, 1992, cold case. Solved. The words felt unreal, stitched together like a sentence from another life. Reporters descended on the town, their cameras trained on the modest houses and empty streets, searching for images that could capture the magnitude of the moment. Old neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, memories flooding back, disbelief etched across their faces. Could it really be over? Could the waiting finally end? But answers, once summoned, rarely arrive neatly packaged. As investigators began to peel back the layers of Daniel Harper's life, new questions emerged, darker, more unsettling. He had lived in Willow Creek in 1992, but only briefly. A rental apartment near the highway. A job that lasted less than a year. Then he vanished, leaving behind no forwarding address, no lingering connections. For decades, he drifted across state lines, working odd jobs, blending into the anonymous sprawl of America's back roads. No arrests. No reported incidents. A ghost moving quietly through the margins of society. How had he evaded suspicion for so long? Why now? What had finally cracked the facade? The confession alone was not enough. Detectives needed corroboration, evidence to anchor his words to reality. They returned to the old case files, tracing every detail, every overlooked scrap. They revisited the ditch where Emily had been found, now overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, the earth soft beneath their boots. They searched for remnants long presumed lost, fragments of truth hidden beneath layers of time. And as they did, the town held its breath, caught between relief and dread, aware that reopening a wound often reveals more than anyone is ready to face. In quiet living rooms across Willow Creek, people sat before glowing screens, watching the story unfold, each update stirring memories they had carefully sealed away. Parents hugged their children tighter. Old friends exchanged solemn glances. Somewhere, Emily's mother stood in the doorway of her daughter's untouched bedroom, fingers tracing the edge of a faded poster on the wall, listening to a stranger on the television speak her child's name with clinical detachment. Closure, they said. Justice, they said. But no word could fully capture the complexity of a grief stretched across 30 years. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets, pooling in the gutters, tracing shimmering paths beneath the streetlights. The same rain that had soaked the highway during that fateful traffic stop, the same rain that had blurred the boundary between past and present, between a forgotten crime and its long-delayed reckoning. And in its steady rhythm, there was a reminder. Some stories refuse to remain buried, no matter how deeply they are hidden. They wait, they linger, they watch, and when the moment is right, they rise, demanding to be heard. Because this was never just the story of a man pulled over on a lonely road. It was the story of a town forced to confront its own shadows, of a family trapped in an endless vigil, of a single night in 1992 whose consequences rippled outward for decades. It was a story about memory and denial, about the fragile line between ordinary life and unimaginable violence. And as the first light of dawn crept across the Illinois horizon, illuminating the wet pavement and the silent fields, one truth settled heavily over Willow Creek. The cold case was no longer cold, but the darkness it revealed was far from gone. The interrogation room was cold, its fluorescent lights humming softly above a steel table scarred by years of restless hands and quiet confessions, and Daniel Harper sat motionless in its center, his wrists cuffed, his gaze fixed on a spot just beyond the wall, as if the past itself were standing there, waiting. The rain still clung to his jacket, darkening the fabric, the faint smell of wet asphalt and stale alcohol hanging in the air, while two detectives studied him from across the table, their faces a careful blend of restraint and disbelief. 30 years of silence had led to this moment, and yet the words that had spilled out on the roadside now seemed to retreat, coiling back into the shadows of his mind. They began gently, confirming his name, his address, the slow geography of his life since leaving Willow Creek, and he answered in clipped phrases, each syllable measured, controlled. But when they spoke Emily Carter's name, something shifted.
His jaw tightened.
His shoulders sagged. The room seemed to contract, the walls inching closer, the air thickening with memory. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the careful mask had cracked. He said he had carried her face with him for 3 decades, that he saw it in every darkened window, every passing stranger, every moment of quiet. He said he had learned to live with the noise of guilt, but never with the silence that followed it. In August of 1992, he had been 24, newly arrived in Willow Creek, chasing the promise of steady work and a chance to start over after a string of failures that had left him restless and bitter. He rented a small apartment near the highway, furnished it sparsely, and spent his evenings driving aimlessly through town, learning its rhythms, its habits, its blind spots. He noticed the diner almost immediately, its glowing sign a beacon in the dark, and he began stopping there late at night, lingering over coffee, listening to the hum of tired conversations. That was where he first saw Emily. She had been wiping down the counter, her hair pulled back, a loose strand falling across her cheek, her expression focused but gentle. He remembered the way she smiled at customers, not the practiced grin of obligation but something softer, as if she were genuinely glad they were there. He remembered thinking she looked too young to be standing beneath those harsh lights, too hopeful for a place that thrived on exhaustion. He came back the next night, and the next, always at the end of her shift, always alone. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they did not. But a fragile connection formed, woven from small exchanges and unspoken assumptions. On the night she vanished, the diner was unusually quiet. A summer storm had chased most travelers off the road, leaving only a handful of regulars scattered across the booths. Emily finished her closing duties early, stepping outside into air heavy with the promise of rain. Daniel was waiting in his car. He said he offered her a ride, that she hesitated, glancing back at the empty building, weighing the familiar against the unknown. He said she eventually agreed, slipping into the passenger seat, pulling her jacket tight around her shoulders. They drove along the back roads, past fields that shimmered faintly in the moonlight, the silence between them stretched thin. What happened next, he claimed, was never planned. An argument sparked over something trivial, a misunderstanding, a word taken the wrong way. His frustration, long suppressed, erupted. The car swerved onto the gravel shoulder. Voices rose. Doors slammed. And in that charged, breathless space between anger and regret, he struck her. Once. Then again. The force of it shocked him, snapped him into a terrible clarity.
She fell.
He panicked. He said he tried to wake her, that he whispered her name, that he shook her shoulders until his hands ached. But she did not move. Fear surged, eclipsing reason. He dragged her body to the ditch, the mud swallowing her weight, the night closing over them like a curtain. Then he drove away, his heart hammering, the image of her stillness burning itself into his mind. The detectives listened in silence, their pens scratching steadily across notepads, each detail another thread to be tested, another claim to be verified. Confessions, they knew, could be fragile things shaped by guilt, fantasy, or the simple desire to end a long torment. They needed proof. They pressed him for specifics. The exact road, the turnoff, the landmarks he remembered, the clothes she wore, the words she spoke. He answered haltingly, dredging details from a well of memory he had sealed long ago. Some matched the case file. Others did not. The gaps between them loomed large. Forensic teams were dispatched to the locations he described, guided by his uncertain directions. They combed through weeds and soil, searching for any fragment that time might have spared, a scrap of fabric, a buried personal item, a trace of blood preserved in the earth. Technology had advanced beyond anything imagined in 1992, and investigators hoped that even the smallest remnant could yield DNA, could anchor his story to reality. Meanwhile, analysts reopened old evidence, subjecting it to modern testing, hoping to find what had once been invisible. As the investigation reignited, the town was pulled back into the orbit of the crime. Neighbors who had long since made peace with uncertainty found their routines disrupted by memories they had carefully compartmentalized. Old witnesses were summoned, their recollections probed for overlooked details. Former co-workers of Emily returned to the diner, now remodeled and renamed, standing beneath brighter lights, tracing the ghost of a girl who once moved quickly between tables. Some wept openly. Others spoke in clipped tones, defensive, wary of being judged for what they had not seen, what they had not said. One woman remembered a dark sedan idling across the street that night, its headlights off. A man leaning against the hood, smoking, watching the door. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Another recalled Emily mentioning a regular customer who made her uneasy, who asked personal questions, who lingered after closing. She had laughed it off, brushing aside the concern. A third remembered hearing raised voices outside, faint, distant, carried on the wind, but by the time she stepped to the window, the street was empty. Each fragment added texture, depth, but no certainty. 30 years had blurred edges, softened contours, warped timelines. Memory was a treacherous witness, reshaping itself with each retelling. Investigators moved carefully, aware that the truth they sought lay buried beneath layers of perception and fear. Emily's parents were brought into the station, ushered into a quiet room where detectives spoke gently, deliberately, choosing each word with care. They listened, hands clasped, faces pale, absorbing the revelation that a man had finally confessed to taking their daughter's life. Relief and anguish collided within them, a violent mingling of gratitude and grief. For decades, they had imagined this moment, the long-awaited answer to their prayers, but now that it had arrived, it felt impossibly heavy. No confession could restore what had been stolen. No explanation could soften the brutality of the loss. Her mother asked to see him. The request hung in the air, charged, uncertain. After careful consideration, it was granted. She entered the interrogation room alone, the door closing softly behind her, and for a moment, neither spoke. She studied his face, searching for some reflection of the monster she had envisioned, some visible marker of the man who had destroyed her family. Instead, she saw a tired, broken figure, eyes rimmed with red, shoulders sagging beneath an invisible burden. The banality of his appearance unsettled her more than any imagined horror. He began to apologize, his voice trembling, but she raised a hand, stopping him. She did not shout. She did not cry. She simply asked why. And in that question, all the years of waiting converged, demanding a meaning that could never truly exist. Outside, the world pressed on, indifferent. Cars passed along Route 47, their tires whispering over wet pavement. Children hurried to school. Farmers checked their fields. Life continued, as it always does, even in the shadow of unimaginable pain. But beneath the surface, Willow Creek was shifting, its carefully maintained equilibrium disturbed. Conversations turned hushed, guarded. Old suspicions resurfaced. People looked at one another with renewed scrutiny, wondering what secrets might still be hidden behind familiar faces. As evidence trickled in, The case teetered between resolution and doubt. A fragment of fabric recovered from a shallow depression near the ditch matched the description of Emily's missing jacket, its fibers degraded but distinct. Trace DNA, painstakingly extracted from old fingernail scrapings, produced a partial profile that analysts said was consistent with Daniel Harper. Consistent, but not conclusive. The margins of error loomed large. Defense attorneys prepared to challenge every link, every assumption, ready to dismantle the narrative piece by piece. And then, another discovery surfaced, one that threatened to fracture the fragile clarity of the confession. Records revealed that Daniel had been questioned briefly in 1992, his name appearing in a list of patrons who frequented the diner. At the time, his alibi had checked out. He claimed he had been at home, and a neighbor corroborated the story. The lead was dropped. The file closed. Now, with hindsight, the omission burned like a scar. Had he nearly been caught? Had he manipulated the investigation from the start? Or was the confession itself a fabrication, a desperate attempt to atone for some other, unnamed sin? Detectives confronted him with the discrepancy. He stared at the table, his silence stretching. Finally, he admitted that the neighbor had lied for him, that he had begged, pleaded, leveraged fear and sympathy to secure her silence. She had since died, her secret buried with her. The admission added another layer of darkness to the tale, a reminder of how easily truth can be bent, how many small decisions conspire to create an enduring lie. The case tightened around him like a noose, each new detail narrowing the path of escape. And yet, uncertainty lingered, a thin, persistent thread that refused to be severed. Because in cold cases, certainty is always a fragile thing, assembled from fragments, vulnerable to collapse. As night fell once more over Willow Creek, the rain finally ceased, leaving the streets slick and reflective, mirrors for a town forced to confront its own reflection. In the quiet that followed, the weight of 30 years pressed down, heavy and inescapable. The confession had reopened old wounds, stirred long-dormant fears, and unsettled the fragile peace built atop unanswered questions. And as the investigation pushed forward, driven by the relentless pursuit of truth, one realization took hold. Solving a cold case does not erase the past. It resurrects it, dragging every shadow, every regret, every buried secret back into the light, demanding to be faced. Because beneath the headlines and the courtroom drama, beneath the language of justice and closure, there lay a deeper reckoning, one that would test the resilience of a family, the integrity of a community, and the fragile boundary between guilt and redemption. And in that reckoning, nothing would remain untouched. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a sterile calm stretched tight across its polished benches, and yet beneath that surface, tension coiled like a living thing, waiting. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras poised, notebooks ready. Members of the Carter family sat together in the front row, hands intertwined, their faces etched with a mix of resolve and exhaustion. Across the aisle, Daniel Harper stood in a press suit borrowed from a public defender's office, his posture rigid, eyes lowered, the weight of 3 decades bearing down on his shoulders. Outside, the sky hung low and gray, as if even the weather had been summoned to bear witness. The charges were read slowly, deliberately. First-degree murder, aggravated assault, concealment of a corpse. Each word landed like a blow, echoing through the room, reverberating in the stillness. Harper did not look up. He did not flinch. When asked to enter a plea, his voice was barely audible. Not guilty. The phrase rippled outward, a shockwave of disbelief, slicing through the fragile hope that had bloomed in Willow Creek since his confession. A murmur swept the gallery, rising, falling, then dissolving into a strained silence. 30 years of waiting had led to this, and still, certainty remained just out of reach. The prosecution began to build its case piece by piece, weaving together confession, forensic evidence, and the fragile tapestry of memory. They spoke of Emily Carter's final hours, reconstructing her movements with painstaking care. They described the diner, the late summer heat, the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They mapped the route Daniel claimed to have driven, overlaying it with the coordinates of the crime scene, demonstrating how seamlessly the two aligned. They presented the recovered fabric fragment, its faded fibers magnified on a screen, and the partial DNA profile that, though degraded, pointed steadily in his direction. But the defense was relentless. They dismantled assumptions, highlighted inconsistencies, exploited every gap. They questioned the reliability of a confession offered under emotional duress, decades after the fact. They scrutinized the forensic methods, emphasizing the fragility of degraded samples, the statistical uncertainties, the ever-present risk of contamination. They called experts who spoke in careful, measured tones about cognitive decay, about the malleability of memory, about the possibility of false confession born from guilt, loneliness, or a desperate need for absolution. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof lay not in plausibility, but in certainty. As testimony unfolded, the story of 1992 came alive again, each witness adding another layer to the mosaic. Former detectives took the stand, their voices tinged with regret as they recounted the frantic early days of the investigation, the sleepless nights, the leads that evaporated under scrutiny. They spoke of limited resources, of the technological constraints of the era, of the relentless pressure to deliver answers in a community desperate for reassurance. They admitted mistakes, oversights, the small compromises that, in retrospect, loomed large. One officer described the moment he had first stood beside Emily's body, the shock of seeing someone so young rendered so still. His voice faltered as he recalled the look in her eyes, the sense of urgency that propelled the initial search, the slow, crushing realization that they might never find her killer. Another testified about the brief encounter with Daniel Harper, the fleeting suspicion, the neighbor's alibi that seemed airtight at the time. The admission hung heavy in the room. A single decision, made under pressure, had allowed a murderer to vanish into the anonymous expanse of a country. Then came the witnesses who had known Emily best. Her co-workers spoke of her kindness, her reliability, her dreams of escape. They described the late nights, the camaraderie forged beneath flickering lights, the small rituals that marked the end of each shift. One woman, now gray-haired, recounted Emily's laughter, the way it cut through fatigue like a blade of light. Her words drew tears from the gallery, the memory of a life paused, suspended forever in youth. Emily's mother took the stand, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke of bedtime stories, of scraped knees and school projects, of a daughter who never stopped asking questions. She described the night Emily did not come home, the hours of pacing, the phone calls that went unanswered, the creeping dread that settled into her bones. When she described identifying her daughter's body, the room seemed to hold its breath, the silence thick with collective grief. Even the defense lowered their eyes. Daniel Harper did not testify. His attorneys advised against it, warning that any misstep could unravel their carefully constructed strategy. Instead, they painted a portrait of a man haunted by regret, burdened by a crime he did not commit but felt compelled to confess to, driven by an overwhelming desire to end his own suffering. They suggested he had been nearby that night, had heard rumors, had pieced together a narrative that fit the evidence, a story he repeated until it felt real. They implied that the true killer might still be free, shielded by time and chance. The jury listened, their faces inscrutable, absorbing each argument, each emotional appeal, each technical explanation. Days blurred together, testimony bleeding into testimony, the relentless rhythm of the trial mirroring the relentless passage of the years that preceded it. Outside, the town oscillated between hope and dread, coffee shops buzzing with speculation, living rooms echoing with debate. Lawn signs appeared overnight, some proclaiming justice for Emily, others urging caution, reminding neighbors of the sanctity of due process. The fracture lines of uncertainty ran deep. When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom vibrated with anticipation. The prosecution spoke of accountability, of the moral imperative to confront the past, of the courage it took to confess. They urged the jury to see the coherence of the narrative, the convergence of evidence, the unmistakable pattern pointing to a single conclusion. The defense countered with a plea for restraint, a reminder of the irreversible consequences of a guilty verdict, the dangers of convicting on emotion rather than incontrovertible proof. They asked the jurors to imagine the possibility of error, to weigh doubt with the gravity it deserved. Deliberations stretched on, hour after hour. The jury sequestered in a quiet room, their discussions hidden from view. Each knock on the courtroom door sent a ripple of tension through the spectators. Emily's parents sat rigid, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles blanched. Daniel stared at the floor, his breath shallow, his future suspended in that sealed space. When the verdict finally came, the room rose as one. The foreperson stood, a folded slip of paper trembling slightly in her grasp.
Guilty.
The word fell into the silence, heavy, irrevocable. A gasp escaped the gallery. Emily's mother closed her eyes, tears spilling over, her husband's arm wrapping around her shoulders. Across the aisle, Daniel's knees buckled, his lawyers studying him as the reality of the moment crashed down. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge spoke of the gravity of the crime, of the decades of suffering inflicted on a family and a community. He spoke of deterrence, of the need for justice tempered by humanity. Daniel Harper was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years, a symbolic echo of the time he had spent in freedom since the night of the murder. As the gavel fell, a murmur swept the room, relief and sorrow intertwined. For Willow Creek, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but it did not erase the scars. The diner installed a small plaque near the entrance, bearing Emily's name and the dates of her life, a quiet memorial to a girl who had once filled the space with warmth. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, candles flickered along Main Street, their soft glow a reminder of loss and resilience. Yet even as the town sought to heal, questions lingered. Was every detail of the confession true? Had the investigation, constrained by time and technology, missed something irretrievable? Could absolute certainty ever exist in a case resurrected from the depths of memory? These doubts whispered through conversations, through late-night reflections, through the uneasy dreams of those who had lived too long in the shadow of an unsolved crime. In his cell, Daniel Harper confronted the echo of his own words, the story he had told now locked into the permanent record of law. Whether driven by guilt, truth, or some tangled fusion of both, his confession had altered the trajectory of countless lives. He spent his days in routine, his nights replaying the moments that had led him there, the rain-soaked highway, the flicker of red and blue lights, the fragile second in which everything had finally unraveled. And so the cold case, once a wound that refused to close, settled into a new, uneasy state of being. Officially solved, yet forever marked by uncertainty. A story retold in headlines and hushed conversations, a cautionary tale about the persistence of memory and the relentless pull of the past. In Willow Creek, the echoes of 1992 still drifted through the quiet streets, a reminder that some nights never truly end. They simply fade into the background, waiting for the smallest spark to bring them roaring back to life. The prison gates closed behind Daniel Harper with a hollow clang that echoed across the concrete yard, a sound that seemed to seal not just his fate, but the final chapter of a story that had haunted an entire town for 3 decades. Yet even as the state declared the case closed, even as the headlines faded and reporters packed their equipment, the past refused to stay still. It stirred in quiet corners, whispered through late-night phone calls, lingered in the uneasy glances exchanged between neighbors who had once believed they knew each other completely. Closure, it turned out, was not a single moment, but a long, uncertain process, and Willow Creek was only beginning to understand its cost. In the weeks following the verdict, detectives returned to the case file, not out of obligation, but unease. Something about the confession still gnawed at them, an intangible friction between the narrative and the evidence. They replayed recordings, scrutinized transcripts, revisited photographs that had yellowed with age. They reconstructed timelines again and again, searching for alignment, for coherence, for the elusive certainty that could finally quiet their doubts. And each time, they found themselves circling the same shadows. There were hours unaccounted for on the night Emily vanished, small gaps in the chronology that resisted closure. Witness statements overlapped imperfectly. Memories contradicted one another in subtle ways. Even the route Daniel claimed to have driven offered multiple variations, each plausible, each leading to slightly different conclusions. The forensic evidence, though compelling, remained incomplete, its degraded fragments vulnerable to interpretation. In the cold calculus of criminal justice, the case had been won. In the quieter mathematics of truth, it remained unresolved. One detective, nearing retirement, began working the case alone after hours, driven by a restlessness he could not explain. He traced Daniel's movements in the years following 1992, mapping a life lived in fragments. Construction sites in Missouri, a warehouse job in Iowa, seasonal labor in southern Illinois, short-term rentals, temporary friendships, a pattern of disappearance and reinvention that suggested not only evasion, but fear. Yet nowhere in that trail did he find evidence of further violence. No arrests, no allegations, no whispers. It was as if Daniel had sealed the darkest part of himself in a locked room and thrown away the key. Then, buried in an overlooked folder, the detective found a report that shifted everything. A call logged 3 days after Emily's disappearance. An anonymous tip, dismissed at the time as unreliable. The caller claimed to have seen a young woman matching Emily's description arguing with 2 men near the old quarry road late that night. 2 men, not one. The tipster provided vague descriptions, nothing that could be acted upon with confidence. The report had been filed, noted, and quietly forgotten. The detective stared at the page, a chill creeping up his spine.
2 men.
The possibility opened a door that had long been sealed, revealing a corridor of unsettling questions. Had Daniel been alone? Had he minimized his role, or exaggerated it, to protect someone else? Or had the tip itself been a fabrication, a ghost story conjured from fear and rumor? He tracked down the original caller, only to learn that the number no longer existed, the identity lost to time. He revisited the quarry road, now overgrown and partially collapsed, its jagged edges softened by years of neglect. Standing there, listening to the wind move through tall grass, he tried to imagine the scene as it might have been. Raised voices, shadows shifting, the scrape of gravel beneath hurried footsteps. The past felt close, almost tangible, yet impossibly distant. Back in Willow Creek, the town grappled with its own contradictions. Memorials to Emily multiplied, small but earnest gestures of remembrance, a scholarship fund in her name, a mural painted on the side of a community center, a bench overlooking the river where she once liked to sit. These tributes offered comfort, a sense of purpose, but they also served as constant reminders of a wound that could never fully heal. For some, the verdict brought peace. For others, it reignited old doubts, suspicions they had buried under the weight of official resolution. Whispers began to circulate, cautious at first, then more insistent. Had the right man truly been convicted? Was the confession complete? In coffee shops and barber chairs, in church basements and grocery store aisles, people replayed fragments of the story, testing alternative explanations. Some remembered a local troublemaker who had left town shortly after the murder, his departure sudden and unexplained. Others recalled a pair of drifters seen camping near the quarry that summer, their faces lost to memory, their names never recorded. Each recollection added another layer to the fog, complicating what had once seemed so clear. Emily's parents avoided these conversations, retreating into the fragile sanctuary of their home. For them, the verdict was not a puzzle to be solved, but a boundary, a line beyond which they could no longer afford to look. The man who had confessed sat in a prison cell. The law had spoken. Reopening the case, even in imagination, threatened to unravel the delicate balance they had achieved, the first fragile sense of peace in 30 years. Yet even they felt the tremor of uncertainty, a faint vibration beneath their grief. reminding them that the truth, whatever it was, remained stubbornly out of reach. In prison, Daniel Harper settled into routine, his days measured by counts and meals, his nights stretched long and silent. He kept mostly to himself, avoiding confrontation, earning a reputation as a quiet, compliant inmate. But in the isolation of his cell, the past surged relentlessly. Memories he had suppressed for decades returned with new intensity, no longer restrained by the defenses of freedom. He dreamed of rain and headlights, of gravel biting into his palms, of a young woman's startled eyes. Sometimes he woke gasping, his heart pounding, the echo of her name on his lips. During a counseling session, mandated as part of his intake, he spoke haltingly about guilt, about the corrosive effect of carrying a secret for so long. He described the way it had hollowed him out, the constant vigilance, the fear that every knock at the door would be the last. He admitted to embellishing parts of his confession, smoothing rough edges, filling gaps with assumptions, constructing a narrative that felt complete. The revelation sent a ripple of alarm through the prison's psychological services unit, though it remained confined within institutional walls, never reaching the courtroom that had already rendered its judgment. Outside, the detective who had unearthed the anonymous tip wrestled with his conscience. He compiled a supplemental report, careful, precise, outlining the new questions, the unresolved threads. He submitted it to his superiors, aware that it might be shelved, ignored, or quietly filed away. The official response was swift and unequivocal. The case had been adjudicated. Reopening it would risk re-traumatizing the family and destabilizing the community. Unless new, definitive evidence emerged, the matter was considered closed. The detective accepted the decision, but the unease remained, a low-grade ache that followed him into retirement. He took long walks through town, past the diner, past the riverbank, past the modest houses where so many memories were anchored. He wondered how many stories lay hidden beneath the town's tranquil surface, how many lives intersected in ways never fully understood. The case of Emily Carter, once a singular tragedy, had become a prism through which he viewed everything else, a reminder of the limits of certainty and the enduring power of doubt. Years began to pass. New families moved into Willow Creek. Old landmarks disappeared, replaced by modern facades. Children who had not yet been born in 1992 grew up hearing Emily's story as a cautionary legend, a tale of danger and resilience. The scholarship fund flourished, sending dozens of students to college, a living tribute to a life cut short. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the intensity of the past receded, settling into a quieter, more manageable form. Yet on certain nights, when the wind rose and rain lashed against the windows, the old fears returned. People lay awake, listening to the storm, imagining the echo of distant sirens, the flash of red and blue lights against wet pavement. The memory of that traffic stop, that accidental unraveling of a decades-old secret, hovered at the edge of consciousness, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, only waiting. Because beneath every solved cold case lies another, more elusive mystery, the question of whether truth and justice can ever fully align. In Willow Creek, the answer remained suspended, a fragile balance between belief and skepticism, hope and resignation. The story of Emily Carter had been written into the town's identity, shaping its fears, its compassion, its understanding of loss. And as time marched on, indifferent to the weight of human sorrow, that story continued to pulse quietly beneath the surface, an unresolved chord in the long, complex symphony of memory. The rain would fall again. Headlights would slice through the dark. And somewhere, in the space between what was known and what would never be known, the echo of a single night in 1992 would endure, unresolved, unforgotten, a whisper that refused to fade. Time did what it always does in places scarred by tragedy. It layered new routines over old wounds, muffling their edges but never fully erasing their shape. In Willow Creek, the seasons continued their slow rotation, summers heavy with cicada song and cut grass, winters sharp with frost and silence. People married, divorced, buried parents, welcomed children. The diner where Emily once worked changed owners twice, its booths replaced, its sign repainted, its floors scrubbed until no trace of that final night remained. And yet, beneath every fresh coat of paint, beneath every cheerful renovation, the memory of her absence lingered, woven into the town's subconscious like a buried current. The scholarship fund in Emily's name grew steadily, fueled by annual charity runs, bake sales, and anonymous donations. Each year, a local student stood on a small stage in the high school auditorium, trembling with gratitude as they accepted an award that carried Emily's name. Her parents attended every ceremony, their applause soft but resolute, their presence a living reminder of what had been lost and what might still be redeemed. In these moments, grief transformed into purpose, sorrow into resolve. It was not closure, but it was survival. Yet far beyond the town's borders, the story continued to ripple outward, its impact magnified by distance and imagination. True crime podcasts dissected the case in obsessive detail, their hosts poring over transcripts, crime scene photos, and trial footage, weaving theories that ranged from plausible to fantastical. Online forums bloomed with speculation, armchair detectives arguing late into the night about timelines, motives, and the unsettling possibility of a second perpetrator. Daniel Harper's name became a cipher, a blank canvas onto which strangers projected their fears and fascinations. For some, he was the embodiment of long-delayed justice. For others, a convenient scapegoat in a narrative too tidy to be trusted. The resurgence of public interest reopened wounds the town had worked so hard to cauterize. Journalists returned, seeking fresh angles, knocking on doors that had already endured too many intrusions. Old witnesses found themselves drawn back into interviews, their words extracted, edited, and rebroadcast, stripped of context, reshaped for dramatic effect. Even Emily's parents were not spared, their private grief transformed into consumable content, their most intimate memories repurposed as narrative devices. The glare of attention was relentless, unforgiving, and it stirred a quiet resentment among those who had lived the story rather than merely observed it. In the midst of this renewed scrutiny, an unexpected letter arrived at the county prosecutor's office, postmarked from a correctional facility hundreds of miles away. The handwriting was careful, almost delicate, each letter shaped with deliberate restraint. It was from Daniel Harper. Inside, he wrote of regret and insomnia, of memories that refused to loosen their grip. He wrote of the trial, of the faces he could not forget, of the mother who had stood before him and asked why. And then, near the end, he wrote a sentence that reignited every dormant doubt. "There are things I did not say, because I was not the only one there." The letter sent a tremor through the already fragile sense of resolution. Prosecutors debated its meaning, weighing the risks of reopening a case that had already consumed enormous resources and emotional capital. Was it an attempt at manipulation, a desperate bid for relevance, a calculated effort to fracture the fragile peace? Or was it a confession within a confession, an admission too heavy to carry alone? The ambiguity gnawed at them, the words lingering like an unsolved riddle. The detective who had once uncovered the anonymous tip was consulted, his voice cautious but insistent. He urged a review, a limited inquiry, a careful probing of the shadows Daniel's letter had illuminated. Others argued for restraint, warning that even a minor reopening could unravel years of healing, subjecting the Carter family and the entire town to another cycle of trauma. The debate stretched on, mirroring the larger conflict between justice and mercy, truth and stability. In the end, a small task force was quietly assembled, its mandate narrow and discreet. They revisited the quarry road, deploying ground-penetrating radar, drones, and forensic dogs, technologies unavailable in 1992. They combed through land records, construction permits, and property transfers, searching for evidence of disturbance, concealment, or hasty abandonment. They re-examined old tips, cross-referencing them with modern databases, tracing names and vehicles that had once dissolved into anonymity. What they found was subtle, fragmentary, but unsettling. Soil samples near the quarry revealed traces of automotive fluids inconsistent with Daniel's vehicle. Tire impressions, long degraded, hinted at a second set of tracks. A rusted beer can, unearthed from a shallow depression, bore partial fingerprints that did not match Daniel or Emily. None of it was definitive. All of it suggested possibility. The investigation extended beyond Willow Creek, following faint trails across state lines, reconstructing the movements of transient workers, seasonal laborers, and short-term residents who had passed through the area that summer. Records were incomplete, memories unreliable. Many had died. Others could not be located. The past resisted reconstruction, its fragments scattered too widely, its witnesses too diminished. Meanwhile, Daniel remained in his cell, his days punctuated by the ritual of count and meal, his nights haunted by visions he could no longer suppress. In another letter, never sent, he wrote of the second man, a figure half-formed in his memory, someone he had met only days before, someone whose name he struggled to recall. He wrote of fear, of shared guilt, of a pact forged in panic and sealed by silence. He wrote of the moment he realized that confessing alone might be easier than unraveling a truth that implicated another life. The letter remained hidden beneath his mattress, its words trapped in the limbo between confession and denial. Back in Willow Creek, rumors of renewed investigation seeped into the community despite official denials. The old unease resurfaced, subtle but persistent. People began locking their doors again, checking windows twice before bed. Conversations trailed off when strangers entered the room. The sense of safety, once restored, flickered uncertainly, threatened by the realization that the past might not be finished with them after all. Emily's parents sensed the shift immediately. They confronted the prosecutor, demanding honesty, clarity, an end to the half-truths that had defined so much of their lives. When they learned of Daniel's letter, their reactions diverged. Her father burned with anger, convinced that the man was manipulating them, prolonging their suffering for reasons only he could understand. Her mother, quieter, felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the old instinct to search for answers no matter the cost. They argued late into the night, voices low, grief and hope colliding once more. In the fragile space between these competing impulses, the town waited. For some, the possibility of another perpetrator reopened wounds they had only just begun to close. For others, it offered a grim solace, that the evil of that night might not be reducible to a single face, that the randomness of violence was not as arbitrary as it seemed. Each interpretation carried its own burden, its own uneasy logic. As weeks turned into months, the task force's efforts yielded no conclusive breakthroughs. Leads evaporated. Names circled back to silence. The quarry road surrendered nothing more. The rusted beer can remained an anomaly, its partial prints untraceable in any database. The second set of tire impressions could not be definitively dated. The investigation stalled, suspended once again in the gray space between suspicion and proof. And so, gradually, the momentum faded. Resources were reallocated. Files were returned to storage. Officially, the case remained closed, the supplementary inquiry quietly shelved. But the questions it raised refused to vanish. They lingered in whispered conversations, in the restless dreams of those who had lived too long with uncertainty, in the hollow spaces where certainty ought to have resided. Because some stories resist neat endings. They fray at the edges, unraveling just enough to remind us of their complexity, their refusal to conform to our desire for order. The story of Emily Carter had become one of those narratives, a cautionary tale about the limits of justice and the endurance of doubt. And in the quiet moments before sleep, when the world receded and memory stirred, Willow Creek felt once more the faint, insistent echo of a single night in 1992, still unresolved, still whispering its unanswered questions into the darkness. The quiet that followed the shelving of the renewed investigation was not the peace Willow Creek had hoped for, but a brittle stillness, a fragile truce between exhaustion and unresolved fear. On the surface, life resumed its measured rhythm, yet beneath it, something had shifted. The knowledge that the past might still be incomplete settled into the town like a low fog, blurring the edges of certainty, softening even the firmest convictions. The verdict remained. The sentence stood. But the story no longer felt finished. In the months that followed, subtle changes emerged. People began noticing things they had once ignored. A man walking his dog at dawn along the riverbank paused when he spotted a weathered shoe lodged in the reeds, its style eerily reminiscent of early 90s fashion. It turned out to be nothing more than discarded trash, but the jolt of recognition lingered. A teenager exploring the abandoned quarry road with friends uncovered a rusted key buried beneath loose stones, sparking a flurry of speculation before investigators confirmed it bore no connection to the case. Each false alarm fed the same restless energy, the same quiet insistence that the truth had not yet fully surfaced. Local law enforcement, though officially disengaged, found themselves fielding a steady trickle of calls. Anonymous tips arrived at odd hours, their voices distorted by fear or anonymity, offering fragments of rumor and half-remembered encounters. A man who claimed to have shared a campsite with two strangers near Willow Creek in 1992. A woman who swore she had seen Emily speaking with someone other than Daniel at the edge of the parking lot that night. None of the leads could be substantiated, but each one tugged at the fragile thread of closure, threatening to unravel it once more. The internet amplified these uncertainties, transforming private doubt into public spectacle. Amateur investigators dissected satellite imagery, mapped theoretical routes, constructed timelines dense with conjecture. Old yearbook photos were scrutinized for faces that might match blurry composite sketches. Social media accounts appeared, dedicated solely to Emily's case, their feeds a relentless churn of speculation and sorrow. For Willow Creek, the renewed attention felt like an invasion, a reopening of scars that had barely begun to heal. In prison, Daniel Harper watched these developments from a distance, the news arriving in fragments through contraband phones and whispered conversations. He oscillated between a desperate urge to speak and an equally powerful instinct to remain silent. The second man he had alluded to in his letter haunted him, a shadow that refused to take solid form. He remembered fragments, a name that hovered just beyond recall, a voice roughened by cigarettes, the glint of fear in unfamiliar eyes. He remembered the hurried conversation after Emily lay still, the frantic bargaining, the shared understanding that silence was their only refuge. But memory, warped by time and guilt, refused to crystallize into certainty. During therapy sessions, he circled these recollections, approaching them obliquely, testing their edges. He spoke of shared responsibility, of moral cowardice, of the way panic can weld strangers together in an instant of irreversible consequence. The prison psychologist listened, her expression carefully neutral, documenting his words with clinical precision. She urged him toward clarity, toward specificity, but each attempt only deepened his agitation. The more he tried to remember, the more elusive the details became, slipping through his grasp like water. Beyond the prison walls, the detective who had once championed the supplementary investigation felt the same restless pull. Retirement had not dulled his instincts. If anything, it had sharpened them, stripping away bureaucratic restraint and leaving only a stubborn pursuit of coherence. He spent long evenings revisiting the case, poring over digital copies of old reports, cross-referencing names and addresses, constructing elaborate webs of possibility. His wife worried about the toll it took, the way his sleep fractured, his patience thinned. But he could not let it go. Not when the unanswered questions still whispered so insistently. One evening, while reviewing a list of seasonal workers employed by a nearby construction company in 1992, he noticed a name that had not surfaced before: Michael Rourke. The records were scant, the details minimal, but something about the entry caught his attention. Rourke had worked briefly in the area that summer, residing in a temporary housing complex less than a mile from the diner. He had left abruptly in early September, his forwarding address listed as unknown. No subsequent employment records appeared in state databases. It was as if he had vanished. The detective traced the name through national systems, uncovering a faint trail: a minor arrest in Kentucky in 1995, a brief stint in a rehabilitation facility in Tennessee, a death certificate filed in Nevada in 2008. Rourke had died alone, his body discovered in a motel room, the cause listed as heart failure complicated by substance abuse. No next of kin were recorded. No personal effects remained beyond a worn duffel bag and a stack of unpaid bills. The trail ended there, in anonymity and neglect. Yet the timing unsettled him. The proximity, the abrupt departure. It was not evidence. It was not even suspicion, not in any formal sense. But it was a shadow, and in a case built on shadows, that was enough to provoke unease. He documented his findings, filing them away in a private archive, unsure whether they would ever serve a purpose, but unwilling to let them fade into obscurity. Back in Willow Creek, Emily's parents confronted the relentless churn of speculation with quiet resolve. They limited their public appearances, declined interview requests, and focused their energy on the scholarship fund and local outreach. For them, the constant reopening of the case felt like a betrayal of the fragile peace they had fought so hard to achieve. They had buried their daughter once. They could not endure burying her memory again and again beneath layers of conjecture. Yet in the stillness of their home, doubt crept in. Her mother found herself replaying old conversations, searching for overlooked clues, wondering if Emily had ever mentioned someone else, a name, a face, a fleeting concern. Her father lingered over faded photographs, scrutinizing the backgrounds, the blurred figures at the edges of the frame. Each attempt to anchor memory only deepened the ache of uncertainty. As years slipped quietly by, the case settled into a new, uneasy equilibrium. Officially resolved, privately unsettled, it became a story told with qualifiers, its ending perpetually conditional. Students who received Emily's scholarship learned the outlines of her life, the tragedy of her death, the perseverance of her parents, but the complexities of the investigation faded into abstraction, their significance diluted by time and distance. And yet, in moments of collective reflection, the town still felt the pull of that unresolved night. During storms, when thunder rolled across the fields and lightning fractured the sky, people remembered the rain that had fallen on Route 47, the flash of red and blue lights that had finally cracked open decades of silence. They remembered how easily ordinary moments could tip into irrevocable change, how thin the line was between safety and catastrophe. Because the true legacy of a cold case is not its resolution, but its endurance. It reshapes how a community understands itself, how it measures trust, how it navigates the fragile space between fear and hope. In Willow Creek, the story of Emily Carter had become a quiet compass, orienting every act of caution, every gesture of compassion, every silent prayer whispered into the dark. And so, even as the official record declared the matter closed, the deeper narrative continued to unfold, carried forward in memory, in doubt, in the persistent, unyielding search for meaning. The night of her disappearance remained a living presence, an unanswered question drifting through the years, reminding everyone who felt its weight that some truths resist capture, lingering just beyond the reach of justice, waiting, perhaps forever, to be fully known. The years moved on with a quiet inevitability, yet the story of Emily Carter refused to settle into the past. It lived in the margins of everyday life, in the spaces between conversation and silence, in the way people paused before speaking her name, as if the sound itself might reopen something too fragile to touch. In Willow Creek, memory became a landscape, one navigated with care, its contours shaped by grief, resilience, and an unspoken understanding that some wounds, no matter how old, never fully close. Children who had grown up hearing Emily's story carried it with them into adulthood, its lessons etched subtly into their choices. They locked their doors. They checked in on one another. They learned to read the quiet signals of unease in a friend's voice, to sense when something was wrong even before words were spoken. In this way, Emily's absence became a presence, a silent guardian shaping the town's collective instinct for caution. Yet beneath this vigilance, doubt continued to ripple, faint but persistent. The unresolved questions hovered like a low cloud, casting long shadows over moments that should have been uncomplicated. Each new anniversary brought a familiar ache, a gathering of candles, whispered prayers, and a shared recognition that certainty remained elusive. The ritual was both comfort and burden, a reminder of endurance and of the fragile lines separating closure from resignation. In prison, Daniel Harper aged quickly. The hard lines in his face deepened, his hair thinned, his posture stooped beneath the weight of confinement and remorse. The routines that once provided structure began to blur, days dissolving into one another, their sameness punctuated only by occasional letters and infrequent visits. He spent long hours in the library, reading histories and memoirs, searching for fragments of himself in other people's confessions. Sometimes he wrote, filling notebooks with cramped handwriting, but most of those pages never left his cell. They were exercises in memory, attempts to untangle the web of fear and guilt that had defined so much of his life. The second man, the shadow at the edge of his recollection, continued to haunt him. Over time, the image sharpened slightly, gaining weight and texture. He remembered a scar along the man's jaw, a rough laugh, the smell of cheap cologne mingled with sweat. He remembered meeting him at a bar near the interstate, their conversation fueled by alcohol and restless bravado. He remembered how quickly camaraderie had formed, how easily trust could be forged in the liminal space between strangers. But every time he tried to grasp a name, it slipped away, dissolving into the static of his mind. This uncertainty tormented him more than the certainty of his own guilt. To confess fully, to name another, would be to reopen a wound not just for himself, but for everyone connected to the case. And yet, to remain silent felt like a continuation of the same cowardice that had guided his choices in 1992. He existed in that tension, suspended between the desire for absolution and the fear of consequence, his conscience a relentless, unforgiving judge. Outside, the retired detective's quiet investigation became a solitary obsession. He traveled to Nevada, standing in the faded motel room where Michael Rourke had died, tracing the outlines of a life that seemed to have left no imprint. The manager on duty remembered little. Only a man who paid in cash, kept himself, and left behind a room heavy with the smell of cigarettes and cheap liquor. In a local archive, the detective found a single photograph attached to an old police report, a grainy image of Rourke from his 1995 arrest. He studied the face, comparing it to composite sketches, to blurred recollections described in witness statements. The resemblance was tenuous, but enough to provoke unease. He returned to Willow Creek with the photograph, sharing it discreetly with a handful of former colleagues. Some saw potential. Others dismissed it as coincidence, the product of a mind unwilling to let go. Without definitive evidence, the image remained just another fragment, another question mark in a story already crowded with them. Still, the detective kept it close, a tangible representation of the doubt that refused to fade. Meanwhile, the scholarship fund continued to grow, its reach extending far beyond the town's borders. Recipients wrote letters of gratitude, describing the lives they were building, the opportunities they might never have accessed without that support. For Emily's parents, these letters were lifelines, proof that something beautiful could emerge from unimaginable loss. They kept them in a box beneath their bed, reading them on nights when grief pressed too heavily against their chests. Yet even in these moments of solace, the unanswered questions lurked. Emily's mother sometimes dreamed of her daughter standing at the edge of a field, calling softly, her voice carried away by wind. She woke with the echo of that call still ringing in her ears, a reminder that closure was not a destination, but a fragile, ever-shifting state of being. Her father, more guarded, buried himself in routine, finding comfort in repetition, in the tangible solidity of tasks that required no interpretation. As the 20th anniversary of Daniel Harper's conviction approached, a national documentary team announced plans to revisit the case, promising a definitive exploration of the evidence and its lingering uncertainties. The announcement sent a tremor through Willow Creek, reopening old debates, stirring long-suppressed emotions. Town meetings grew heated, residents divided between those who welcomed renewed scrutiny and those who feared the disruption it would bring. Filming began in quiet corners, the camera lens lingering on familiar landmarks, its presence a silent reminder that the past was never as distant as it seemed. Interviews were conducted in living rooms and empty fields, each participant offering their own version of the story, their own interpretation of its unresolved elements. The process was invasive, exhausting, and strangely cathartic, forcing a collective reckoning with memories that had long been compartmentalized. When the documentary aired, it reignited national interest, its measured tone and meticulous research lending credibility to questions that had once been dismissed as speculation. Viewers debated late into the night, social media alight with theories and analyses. The name Michael Rourke surfaced in online forums, his brief, troubled life dissected with clinical curiosity. For Willow Creek, the attention felt like a double-edged blade, validating long-held doubts while amplifying the town's sense of vulnerability. In the wake of the broadcast, Daniel Harper received a letter from an unknown sender, its contents brief and cryptic. Some secrets rot the soul.
Some only rot the ground.
Choose which one you want to live with. The words unsettled him more than any official inquiry, their implication chillingly clear. He stared at the page for hours, the prison's muted sounds fading into background noise, his mind racing through possibilities, through faces and places long buried. The letter vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving no trace of its origin, no path to follow. And so, the story pressed forward, propelled by the relentless tension between what was known and what might still be hidden. Each new development layered complexity atop complexity, transforming a single tragedy into a sprawling narrative of doubt, resilience, and unending search. The cold case, though officially solved, continued to evolve, its echoes reverberating through time, refusing to be silenced. Because in the end, the most haunting aspect of any unresolved mystery is not the absence of answers, but the persistence of questions. They linger in the spaces between memory and imagination, shaping how we understand ourselves and one another. In Willow Creek, those questions had become a permanent fixture of the landscape, as enduring as the river that wound its way through town, as constant as the changing seasons. And somewhere, beyond the reach of certainty, the truth waited, patient and inscrutable, its contours obscured by time, its presence felt in every restless night, every hesitant breath, every moment of uneasy reflection. The documentary's final frame faded to black, but its aftershock rippled outward, refusing to dissipate. In Willow Creek, the familiar streets felt subtly altered, as if the camera's gaze had stripped away a layer of comfort, exposing the raw contours beneath. Conversation slowed. Eye contact lingered. People weighed their words more carefully, aware that every memory, every assumption, might be called into question. The town had lived with uncertainty for decades, but now that uncertainty had been given a national voice, amplifying its presence, sharpening its edges. Within days, the sheriff's office was inundated with new tips. Calls poured in from across the country, each one claiming to hold the missing piece of the puzzle. Some described long-forgotten encounters with strangers on Illinois backroads. Others offered names, places, half-remembered stories passed down through families like whispered heirlooms. Most were dead ends, their details unraveling under scrutiny, but a few carried a troubling resonance, enough to warrant cautious follow-up. One call, placed late at night from a woman in rural Indiana, described a man she had known briefly in the early 90s, a drifter with a scar along his jaw and a volatile temper. He had spoken once, drunkenly, of a girl in Illinois and of a night he could never escape. She had dismissed it as bravado, the empty theater of a troubled man, but the documentary had resurrected the memory with unsettling clarity. The description echoed Daniel Harper's fragmented recollections, and for a moment, the pieces seemed to hover on the brink of alignment. Investigators traced the lead, following a trail of outdated addresses and disconnected numbers. It ended, as so many did, in ambiguity. The The man had died years earlier in a construction accident, his personal history scattered, his confidences buried. Yet the resonance of the account lingered, another thread woven into the dense tapestry of unresolved possibility. The renewed scrutiny reached into the prison as well. Daniel Harper was summoned for additional questioning, his days punctuated by interviews that reopened old wounds. He spoke carefully, aware that each word could tip the fragile balance between confession and doubt. He reiterated his guilt, the inevitability of his actions, the irreversible harm he had caused. But when pressed about the second man, his voice faltered, memory fragmenting under the strain. He offered impressions rather than facts, shapes rather than names, the outline of a presence that refused to solidify. To the investigators, it was both tantalizing and infuriating, a promise of revelation perpetually deferred. In private, Daniel wrestled with the consequences of silence. The anonymous letter continued to haunt him, its implication gnawing at his resolve. Some secrets rot the soul. Some only rot the ground. The phrase repeated in his mind like a relentless mantra, eroding the fragile justifications he had built. He began to draft another confession, one more expansive, more dangerous, detailing not just his own actions, but the shadowy involvement of another. Each night, he added a few lines, then tore them up, the shredded fragments accumulating in the corner of his cell like fallen leaves. Beyond the walls of the prison, the retired detective felt a renewed sense of urgency. The documentary had validated his long-held unease, transforming private doubt into public discourse. He reconnected with former colleagues, sharing his findings about Michael Rourke and the Indiana tip, urging them to look beyond the boundaries of official closure. Some listened. Others cautioned restraint, reminding him of the emotional toll such pursuits exacted, the fine line between perseverance and obsession. He acknowledged their concern, but pressed on, convinced that the truth, however fragmented, demanded pursuit. He traveled to Indiana, meeting with the woman who had placed the call, listening as she recounted her memories, her voice trembling as long-suppressed images resurfaced. He recorded every detail, cross-referencing dates, locations, names. The story aligned imperfectly with known timelines, but the emotional consistency unsettled him. Fear, guilt, regret, these were not easily fabricated. They left traces, subtle but persistent, etched into the cadence of speech, the hesitation before certain words. Back in Willow Creek, the Carter family retreated further from public view, their home transformed into a sanctuary of silence. They limited contact, shielding themselves from the relentless churn of speculation. Yet even in isolation, the renewed attention seeped in, its presence felt in the hushed tones of neighbors, the cautious glances exchanged in passing. Emily's mother began attending grief counseling again, seeking tools to navigate the resurgence of pain. In those sessions, she spoke of exhaustion, of the emotional whiplash that accompanied each new lead, each revived hope. She spoke of the fragile equilibrium she had built and of how easily it could be shattered. Her father found solace in physical labor, volunteering for community projects, channeling his restless energy into tangible acts of service. He built benches for the park, repaired playground equipment, painted fences. In the steady rhythm of work, he found a temporary reprieve from the relentless questioning. Yet even there, amid the scrape of tools and the smell of fresh lumber, the story lingered, its presence as constant as his own breath. The town council convened special meetings to address the renewed attention, debating how to balance transparency with protection. They established protocols for media engagement, designated spokespersons, created spaces for residents to voice their concerns. The process was imperfect, fraught with tension, but it reflected a collective determination to reclaim agency over their narrative, to resist being reduced to a spectacle of tragedy. As autumn descended, painting the fields in gold and rust, the investigation entered a quieter phase. Leads dwindled. The initial surge of interest subsided, replaced by a familiar, uneasy calm. Officially, nothing had changed. The case remained closed. The sentence remained fixed. Yet beneath the surface, the currents of doubt continued to flow, shaping the town's emotional landscape. In the stillness of long evenings, people found themselves revisiting old memories, testing them against new possibilities. The night of Emily's disappearance replayed in countless minds, its details shifting subtly with each retelling. A shadow where none had been noticed. A sound once dismissed as wind. A face glimpsed too briefly to identify. These imagined revisions blurred the boundary between memory and speculation, transforming certainty into a mosaic of possibility. And through it all, the river flowed, indifferent to human turmoil, its surface reflecting the changing sky, its depths concealing untold histories. Along its banks, candles continued to flicker on anniversaries, their small flames defying the dark, their fragile light a testament to endurance. Each flame represented a question as much as an answer, a reminder that remembrance is both an act of love and a burden of unresolved longing. Because the story of Emily Carter had transcended its origins, evolving into something larger, more complex, a meditation on the nature of truth and the limits of justice. It asked whether resolution was ever truly attainable, or whether the pursuit itself was the only solace available to those left behind. And so, as winter approached and the first snow dusted the rooftops of Willow Creek, the town settled once more into its quiet vigil, aware that the past, though officially sealed, remained alive in memory and doubt. Somewhere, in the intricate weave of half-remembered nights and unsent confessions, the truth persisted, waiting, as it always had, for the fragile convergence of courage and chance to finally bring it into the light. The silence that followed the discovery of the hidden crawl space did not feel empty. It felt loaded, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what would be uncovered next. The house on Brookside Drive had already given up too many secrets, yet something in the air suggested it had not finished speaking. Not yet. Investigators returned before dawn. Floodlights turned the quiet suburban street into a harsh, white corridor. Yellow tape fluttered in the cold morning wind. Neighbors stood behind curtains, watching shapes move through the darkness, watching their ordinary street transform into the center of a nightmare that had been sleeping for more than 30 years. Inside, the forensic team worked in near silence. Every step measured, every movement careful. The crawl space beneath the basement floor became the focal point, a narrow opening leading into a black void that smelled of damp earth and old decay. A technician lowered a camera inside first, its small red light cutting through the darkness. The screen flickered. Dust drifted like snow. Then the camera tilted, and something pale emerged from the shadows.
Not an object.
Not debris.
Bone.
The room froze. The camera moved closer, revealing fragments scattered unevenly across the dirt floor. A partial rib, the curve of a skull, a jaw, still bearing teeth. Human remains, hidden beneath layers of soil and time, buried deliberately, carefully, methodically. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. This was no longer an investigation into a long unsolved murder. It had become a recovery mission, an excavation of buried horror. They shut down the house. Anthropologists were brought in, forensic pathologists, crime scene archaeologists. The crawl space was mapped inch by inch. Soil samples were taken, bone fragments cataloged. The process stretched on for days, then weeks, each hour peeling back another layer of a story someone had tried desperately to erase. Preliminary analysis confirmed what everyone already feared. The remains belonged to a female. Age range: late teens to early 20s. Estimated time of death: early 1990s. The timeline matched, too perfectly. The town's oldest nightmare, once a ghost story, once a faded headline, now lay in pieces beneath the house of a man who had spent decades blending into the background of suburban life. News of the discovery detonated across the region. Human remains found in suspect's home. Possible breakthrough in 1992 Illinois cold case. Community in shock as buried secret surface. Reporters flooded the streets. Satellite trucks lined the block. Helicopters hovered overhead, their rhythmic thumping echoing across rooftops. The quiet town that had once tried to forget now found itself thrust into a merciless spotlight. And at the center of it all sat Thomas Keller. In a small interrogation room, lit by flickering fluorescent lights, Keller stared at the table, his hands cuffed, his posture slumped. He had not spoken since the discovery. Not a word. Not a denial. Not a confession. Just silence. Detectives took turns sitting across from him, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The knife. The fibers. The boot prints. The blood traces. The photographs from the storage unit. And finally, the remains. When they showed him the images from beneath his basement, something changed. A subtle shift. His jaw tightened. His breathing slowed. His eyes flickered, not with shock, not with horror, but with calculation. Still, he said nothing. For hours, the room remained suspended in a tense standoff. Investigators waited for cracks. For anger. For fear. For grief. But Keller offered none of it. His expression remained carefully neutral, as if he were watching a story unfold that had nothing to do with him. Then, near midnight, after nearly 12 hours of silence, he finally spoke. Not a confession. A question. How much did you find? The words hung in the air, thin and razor-sharp. Detectives leaned forward. Enough, one replied. Keller exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that might have been regret or relief. She wasn't supposed to be there, he murmured. The room stiffened. Who? A detective pressed. For a long moment, Keller closed his eyes. When he opened them, the mask slipped. Emily. The name struck like a physical blow. Emily Harper. The missing college student. The face from the posters. The girl frozen forever at 19. She wasn't supposed to die, Keller whispered. The interrogation transformed instantly. Detectives activated recorders. Technicians leaned in. The walls seemed to press closer. What happened that night, Thomas? A voice asked gently. Keller swallowed. I didn't plan it, he said. None of it was planned. He began to speak in fragments, pieces tumbling out of him, as if the story had been trapped inside for decades, pressing against his chest, demanding release. He described seeing Emily at a gas station. A chance encounter. She had been tired,
Lost.
nervous, asking for directions. He offered help.
A ride.
She hesitated, then accepted. He drove. They talked. She trusted him. By the time fear replaced politeness, it was already too late. His words were flat, clinical, stripped of emotion. He spoke of control, of panic, of mistakes cascading into irreversible decisions. He spoke of a struggle, a scream, a blow struck too hard. He claimed it had been an accident. But accidents do not involve ropes. Accidents do not involve restraints. Accidents do not involve burial beneath concrete floors. As he talked, investigators cross-referenced every detail, every claim, every timeline. Some of what he said matched old witness accounts. Some contradicted physical evidence. Some filled in chilling gaps no one had ever been able to explain. When he finished, the room remained silent. Finally, one detective asked, "Were there others?" Keller hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. His eyes dropped. His shoulders sagged. "Yes," he said. The word reverberated through the room like a gunshot. Yes. And with that single admission, the case exploded outward, transforming from one long unsolved murder into something far darker. Search warrants multiplied. Properties tied to Keller were raided. Storage units reopened. Old employment sites re-examined. Investigators began digging into missing persons reports across 3 states, cross-checking dates, locations, vehicle sightings, and witness descriptions. Patterns emerged. Too many to ignore. A woman vanished in Indiana, 1989. Another in Missouri, 1991. A third in rural Illinois, 1994. All shared eerie similarities. Last seen alone, late evening, roadside stops, gas stations, small convenience stores. Always a man offering help. Always a van. Always no trace. Until now. As evidence mounted, the narrative of Thomas Keller shifted violently. No longer a single-case suspect. No longer a man tied to one horrific mistake. He became something else. A predator who had learned how to disappear people. The town struggled to process the revelation. Neighbors who had borrowed his tools. Parents whose children he had coached in Little League. Shop owners who had rung up his groceries. They replayed every memory, searching for signs they had missed, clues they had ignored, red flags buried beneath decades of normalcy. But there were none. That was the most terrifying part. He had been invisible. And perhaps, in that invisibility, lay the true horror of the cold case. Not just that a young woman had vanished, but that the man responsible had walked freely among them, untouched, unchallenged, unrecognized, for over 30 years. As prosecutors prepared charges, forensic teams continued to uncover remains beneath the house. Each fragment was cataloged, analyzed, reconstructed. Slowly, painfully, Emily Harper was brought back from the void, bone by bone, piece by piece. Her family was notified in person. 2 officers stood at their door. Her mother collapsed. Her father stared in silence, his face draining of color, as if the world itself had suddenly lost gravity. Closure, they would later say, felt nothing like peace. It felt like reopening a wound that had never healed. But the story was not finished. Because as Keller sat in his cell, as evidence stacked higher, as prosecutors built what would become one of the most explosive criminal cases in state history, one final truth remained uncertain. How many had he truly taken? And how many, even now, still lay hidden, waiting beneath layers of concrete, soil, and time to be found? The cold case was no longer cold, but its shadows were far from gone. They stretched backward through decades, and forward, into a future that would be forever altered by the moment a patrol officer pulled over a drifting van on a quiet Illinois highway, unknowingly setting in motion the unraveling of a darkness that had waited more than 30 years to surface. The courtroom was packed long before the doors officially opened, a dense mass of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, cameras raised, notebooks open, breath held. Reporters whispered into microphones. Family members clutched photographs that had faded at the edges from decades of handling. Deputies lined the walls, their expressions rigid, hands resting near holsters, eyes sweeping the room with mechanical precision. Outside, the cold Illinois wind cut through the gathered crowd, but inside, the air was thick, electric, vibrating with anticipation and dread. This was no longer just a trial. It was a reckoning, decades overdue. Thomas Keller entered in chains. He looked smaller than he had in the interrogation room, thinner, diminished by the weight of the charges stacked against him. His hair had gone fully gray. His shoulders slumped, but his eyes remained sharp, alert, constantly scanning. There was no sign of remorse, no trace of fear, only calculation, as if he were still measuring every angle, searching for a path of escape even now, even here. The judge took the bench. Silence fell. And then the story of Emily Harper, buried for 33 years, began to unfold in brutal, methodical detail. Prosecutors laid out the timeline with surgical precision. The last verified sighting. The gas station receipt. The partial license plate noted by a clerk who had thought nothing of it at the time. The fibers embedded in the seat of Keller's van. The boot impressions recovered from beneath concrete. The fragments of bone, reassembled into a human shape. Each piece alone seemed small, almost insignificant. Together, they formed a mosaic of horror too clear to deny. Experts testified. Forensic anthropologists described the excavation, the delicate process of separating bone from soil, the careful reconstruction that confirmed age, stature, and identity. DNA analysts walked the jury through genetic markers, through probability ratios so infinitesimal they bordered on mathematical impossibility. Pathologists spoke of trauma, of fractures, of injuries that contradicted every claim of accident. And still, Keller sat motionless. His defense attorneys argued contamination. Misinterpretation. Coincidence. They painted him as an unfortunate man ensnared by circumstance, a victim of a flawed system desperate for closure. But their words sounded hollow, thin against the weight of the evidence, drowned beneath the cumulative gravity of 3 decades of silence. Then came the witnesses. A former coworker who remembered Keller's sudden absence in the summer of 1992, his unexplained time off, his nervous demeanor when he returned. A neighbor who recalled the week-long construction project in Keller's basement, the constant hum of power tools, the smell of wet cement. A retired state trooper who admitted, voice cracking, that he had once stopped a similar van on a rural highway in 1991, let the driver go with a warning, and never knew until now what might have been in the back. Each testimony added another layer. Each memory sharpened the edges of a truth no one wanted to face. When Emily's mother took the stand, the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. She spoke softly, her voice trembling but resolute. She described the night her daughter failed to come home. The endless calls, the frantic drives through empty streets, the years of birthdays without candles, holidays without laughter, hopes that slowly transformed into a permanent ache. He stole her life, she said, staring directly at Keller. And he stole ours. Even Keller could not meet her gaze. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, the prosecution's task was far from complete. Because beneath the central case lay a darker, more sprawling question, one that threatened to tear open dozens of old wounds across the Midwest. How many others? The investigation expanded outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Cold case files long sealed were reopened. Missing persons databases were scoured. Unidentified remains from across Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri were re-examined under new scrutiny. The connections were subtle at first. A receipt here, a partial witness statement there, a vehicle description buried in yellowed pages. But gradually, patterns aligned. A young waitress vanished near Springfield in 1989, last seen accepting a ride. A hitchhiker disappeared along Interstate 70 in 1991. A college freshman went missing outside Peoria in 1994, her car found abandoned at a rest stop, keys still in the ignition. Each case had once been treated as isolated tragedy. Now they were threads of a single tapestry. Search teams descended on properties Keller had once owned, rented, or visited regularly. Abandoned lots, old barns, disused industrial buildings. Even stretches of woodland along highways he had traveled for work. Ground-penetrating radar swept through soil. Cadaver dogs prowled fields and forests, noses low, tails rigid, guided by handlers who knew the smallest change in posture could signal the presence of buried death. They found anomalies, disturbances, places where earth had been turned, then carefully replaced. And in several of those places, they found more bones. Each discovery sent shockwaves through the region. Communities long resigned to never knowing reopened their collective grief. Families who had buried hope decades earlier were summoned into police stations, confronted with the possibility that their missing daughters, sisters, and mothers might finally be coming home. For some, the news brought devastating confirmation. For others, it offered only cruel ambiguity. The media labeled Keller the ghost driver, a man who drifted across state lines, invisible, unremarkable, offering help, exploiting trust, and then erasing existence itself. But investigators knew the reality was more chilling. He had not been a ghost. He had been hiding in plain sight. Every new revelation deepened the horror of his double life. By day, a mechanic, a neighbor, a coach, a man who paid his taxes and waved at passing cars. By night, a hunter, navigating the margins of society where vulnerability met opportunity. Psychological evaluations attempted to map the contours of his mind, but they offered no comfort. No single trauma. No defining trigger. Only a long, slow descent into domination and control, fueled by secrecy and the intoxicating power of getting away with it. Yet as the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to encounter a new obstacle. Silence. Keller stopped talking. He withdrew his earlier cooperation, sealing himself behind layers of legal counsel and procedural delay. Each question about additional victims met with a blank stare. Each attempt to probe deeper met with refusal. And so the search for the full truth stalled. Prosecutors secured a conviction for Emily Harper's murder, sentencing Keller to life, without the possibility of parole. The verdict landed like a thunderclap. Applause erupted in the courtroom. Tears streamed down faces. But beneath the relief lingered unease, because the story still felt unfinished. There were too many gaps, too many unexplained absences, too many families still waiting for answers. And Keller, sitting in a maximum security cell, had become the sole gatekeeper of those answers, holding them tight, locked behind a silence that no legal leverage seemed able to penetrate. Years passed. The house on Brookside Drive was demolished, its foundation torn apart, soil sifted one last time for hidden remains. Nothing more was found. The lot became a vacant scar, a physical reminder of the secrets once buried there. The town tried to move forward, but the echoes lingered. Children grew up hearing the story in whispers. New residents learned the history through hushed conversations and careful glances at the empty plot of land. The name Emily Harper became synonymous with both tragedy and perseverance, a symbol of the relentless pursuit of truth. Yet the deepest wounds belonged to those whose cases remained unresolved. They gathered each year on the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, lighting candles, reading names, clinging to the fragile hope that someday, somehow, the remaining pieces would fall into place. And always, behind the walls of concrete and steel, Thomas Keller sat in silence, his memories intact, his secrets unspoken, a living vault of unsolved horror. Until one winter morning, more than a decade after his conviction, when a prison psychologist filed an unexpected report. Keller had asked to speak. Not to his lawyers, not to the press, but to investigators. He had conditions: immunity from further prosecution, protection from retaliation, and most chilling of all, a guarantee that his story would be heard in full. Because, he claimed, what they knew was only the beginning, and what remained hidden was far worse. The call came just before dawn, slicing through the quiet of the operations center like a blade through silk. A single sentence, delivered in a low, controlled voice, carried the weight of everything that had come before. Thomas Keller is ready to talk. Not to bargain. Not to posture, but to confess. Fully. Completely. On his terms. Within hours, a convoy of unmarked vehicles cut through the winter fog toward the maximum security facility where he had spent the last decade suspended between infamy and oblivion. The prison loomed out of the darkness like a fortress, its concrete walls streaked with frost, its watchtowers glowing faintly under pale floodlights. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and cold steel, and somewhere deep within, a man who had erased lives waited to give them back in fragments of memory. They found him seated at a metal table, wrists resting loosely in front of him, posture relaxed, eyes alert. Age had carved deep lines into his face, but it had not dulled his focus. He looked almost peaceful, as if the burden of decades were finally about to be set down. No lawyers. No cameras. Only two senior detectives, a recorder, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Keller exhaled slowly and began, his voice steady, unhurried, stripped of any trace of performance. He said he had carried the map in his head for years, each location etched into memory with terrifying clarity. He spoke of roads and exits, of cornfields and rivers, of abandoned factories and forgotten quarries. His words formed a geography of disappearance, a shadow atlas charting the quiet corners where the world did not look too closely. As he spoke, investigators sketched, cross-referenced, marked coordinates. With every place he named, the room seemed to darken, as if the air itself were absorbing the weight of what had been hidden. Search teams were mobilized before the first interview ended. Helicopters lifted into the gray morning sky. Convoys of vehicles fanned out across 3 states. In frozen fields and overgrown woodlands, Men and women in protective gear began to dig, guided by GPS coordinates and decades-old recollections. The first discovery came within 48 hours, a shallow grave along a creek bed, concealed beneath layers of silt and leaves. Then another, and another. Each site yielded fragments of bone, scraps of fabric, rusted jewelry, shattered remnants of lives abruptly interrupted. With every recovery, a new family received the call they had both prayed for and dreaded, the confirmation that hope and grief could coexist in a single breath.
Keller continued to speak.
He described the first time, the moment the barrier inside him collapsed. He spoke of fear, then exhilaration, then the steady, addictive certainty that he could act without consequence. He detailed his methods with clinical detachment, explaining how he chose locations, how he avoided patterns, how he erased evidence. His language was precise, almost technical, yet beneath it lay something colder, something stripped of empathy. He did not describe victims. He described logistics, movements, variables,
risks.
The human cost existed only as an abstract. Investigators listened, recording everything, forcing themselves to remain detached even as the magnitude of the revelations expanded beyond comprehension. The numbers climbed.
5, 8,
12, 15. Each confession redrew the boundaries of a case, stretching them outward until the original crime in 1992 seemed like only the visible tip of a vast, submerged horror. Yet even as the truth emerged, uncertainty remained. Keller's memory faltered in places. Dates blurred. Landscapes shifted. Some locations he described yielded nothing, forcing teams to dig deeper, wider, sometimes in vain. And with each empty search, doubt crept in. Was he telling everything? Or was he shaping a final narrative, one that placed him forever at the center of attention, one that granted him control even in captivity? But then came the discovery in the quarry. Hidden beneath a collapsed slab of limestone, investigators uncovered a cluster of remains, intermingled, tangled, as if hurriedly concealed. Forensic analysis confirmed multiple individuals, their identities eventually traced through DNA to missing persons reports from 4 different states. The scale of it silenced even seasoned detectives. It was no longer possible to view Keller as an anomaly, a singular monster. He had become a symbol of the darkest potential within anonymity, a reminder of how easily evil could masquerade as ordinary life. News of the findings spread with explosive speed. Headlines blazed across screens. Vigils sprang up in towns separated by hundreds of miles, yet united by shared loss. Candles flickered in windows. Names long absent from public memory were spoken again, stitched back into the fabric of communal consciousness. And always at the center of it all stood the question no confession could fully answer. Why? Psychologists dissected Keller's statements, searching for motive, for meaning, for a narrative that could render the incomprehensible comprehensible. They spoke of psychopathy, of compulsion, of dissociation. But their analyses felt thin, inadequate, unable to bridge the abyss between explanation and understanding. Some acts, it seemed, resisted interpretation, existing only as stark, brutal facts. As the final locations were searched and the last fragments recovered, the investigation began to draw toward a close. Files thickened. Evidence rooms overflowed. Courtrooms filled once more as families gathered to hear names spoken aloud, to reclaim identities stolen by silence. Memorials were erected. Scholarships established. Streets renamed. Each gesture a fragile attempt to stitch light back into places long shadowed. Keller was returned to his cell, his role complete. He would never walk free. He would never feel sunlight without bars between him and the sky. Yet in those final interviews, there had been no visible relief, no catharsis. Only exhaustion. And perhaps, beneath it, a faint echo of something like regret, though whether for his victims or for himself remained impossible to know. Years later, the case would be taught in criminology courses, dissected in documentaries, debated in endless online forums. It would become shorthand for both the failures and the triumphs of modern investigation, a testament to patience, persistence, and the relentless advance of forensic science. But for those who had lived it, who had carried its weight through sleepless nights and hollow mornings, it would remain something far more intimate. A reminder that beneath the surface of the everyday, unspeakable truths can lie dormant, waiting. That a single, routine traffic stop can fracture time, tearing open decades of buried history. And that even when answers finally emerge, they rarely bring peace. Only understanding. And the heavy knowledge that some mysteries, once solved, leave behind scars that never truly fade. The road where Emily Harper vanished has long since been repaved. New signs stand where old ones rusted away. Cars pass without slowing, their drivers unaware of the story etched invisibly into the asphalt. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world seems suspended between night and morning, there are those who still imagine a figure standing at the edge of the light, waiting for help, waiting for safety, waiting for a future that never came. And in that fragile, haunted space, the echo of the cold case endures, not as a headline, not as a file number, but as a living memory, a whisper carried forward through time, urging vigilance, urging compassion, urging the unyielding pursuit of truth, no matter how long it takes to surface.